Hi everyone, my name is Herkev, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world, where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last episode, we were actually somewhat productive, as we built a few farms that we needed to take on our next project. However, there are a few things that we still need, but before getting too productive, I thought it might be a good idea to write down all of the relevant coordinates on the Nether roof, so that we won't have to look back at old screenshots for reference like some sort of loser. And once that was done, I pretty much immediately forgot what I was supposed to do and decided to make a cobblestone farm. I am not entirely sure why I decided to make a cobblestone farm at this point, as that wasn't one of the things we would need for our next project. However, it's always good to have cobblestone, as we might need it for pistons and other redstone things in the future, so it wasn't a complete waste of time. But nonetheless, I got to designing a cobblestone farm, and when I say design, I actually mean slightly tweaking the design that we used for our basalt farm in our last episode, as I would prefer to not have to rely on my incredibly lacking problem-solving skills. And this time, I actually remembered to record my troubleshooting, which was a big accomplishment for me. But unlike our basalt farm, the cobblestone farm would need to be placed in the overworld, as you can't use water in the Nether. So I thought it might be a good idea to use one of the towers that we had spent an exorbitant amount of time building, but still didn't use for some reason. However, in order to use one of the towers to house our cobblestone farm, we would have to make it significantly more compact, meaning that I did indeed have to rely on my very lacking intellect. And after a while, I had actually managed to make it compact enough to fit in our tower, which was very exciting. However, as I was tinkering with the TNT timer, I came to the very rude realization that the farm was excruciatingly slow, since lava flows 3 times as fast in the Nether than it does in the overworld. The generation of stone was extremely slow, and since I am a man whose time is very valuable, I decided to scrap the design and try to come up with a way to make it faster. However, I still wanted the stone to take on the same shape as our last farm, since I still want it to be as TNT efficient as possible. My main idea was to generate the stone in strips, instead of the single block that our last farm did, as that would make the generation of stone, as well as the stone transportation, significantly faster. The stone would then be pushed downwards to create the same setup of stone that our last farm did. I know, cutting edge technology this is. However, since I am about as smart as an average person who bought the Apple Vision Pro, I had to spend a monstrous amount of time figuring out how I would push the aforementioned strips of stone into the blast area of the TNT. This was an issue since I wanted the farm to generate stone rather than cobblestone, as it is less blast resistant, meaning the farm would be more TNT efficient. And after a significantly longer time that I would like to admit, I remembered that sticky pistons have the ability to pull blocks, which basically solved the issue of transporting the stone strips to the blast chamber. I then set up all of the redstone to have the pistons push all of the stone into our desired shape. But whilst I was tinkering with the timer for our TNT dispenser, I noticed that the stone generators would sometimes generate cobblestone instead of stone, which was rather annoying. However, at this point, I decided that I couldn't be bothered to try to fix it, and simply hope that the issue would somehow go away in a very convenient and magical way. So I jumped back into our hardcore world and started collecting all of the things we would need for our farm. And quite ironically, I needed a lot of cobblestone to make a bunch of pistons. And with my pockets full of hard-earned resources, I got on to filling in the floor for our tower. Then began the action-packed segment of this video where I build a cobblestone farm. But as I was building, I realized that I could make the farm even more TNT efficient by filling the roof of our TNT blast chamber with stone, which I decided to do, as I am a very cheap man who would prefer to not have to spend a bunch of time collecting sand, like some sort of peasant. I then flew off to collect some sand and crafted myself one stack of TNT and gave the farm a quick test. And when I was testing the farm, I noticed that the TNT would sometimes break the walls of our blast chamber, so I covered the entire thing in crying obsidian. And once our testing was complete, we had gotten ourselves a tiny bit more than 3 shulkers of cobblestone, which was good enough. But now that we had built our cobblestone farm, I got on to what I was supposed to do earlier, which was to gather materials for our next project. The next thing we needed for that project was deep slate, and we needed a lot of it, as it was one of the main blocks for our palette. This meant that we would have to spend quite a significant amount of time mining the same block over and over again. But after a while of gathering deep slate, I ran into what was probably the biggest vein of diamonds that I had ever seen, which was very exciting. However, since I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor, I couldn't actually collect them, unless I used TNT, which I was significantly too cheap to do. And after having spent a soul-crushingly long time mining, I finally had all of the building materials I would need to get started with our project, or so I thought, but I rather quickly realized that I had completely run out of obsidian, which was yet another thing we needed. And since I was significantly too impatient to use our bartering farm, I decided to go out to the end and collect a bunch of obsidian from ender chests in end cities. And as you could probably tell by the rather obvious name of this video, and most likely the thumbnail, our next project will be a Nether hub. And by looking at the aforementioned thumbnail, you may have noticed that it isn't ocean themed, which goes against what I said in the beginning of this series. However, I did have a reason to choose such an incredibly stupid and tedious starter base, as I thought it would be nice to have a consistent theme in this world, instead of just throwing random bullshit and hoping for the best. The reason for this is rather simple. YOLO. But anyways, here's a time lapse. And after a while, we had made quite a decent amount of progress, as we were basically finished with the basalt and deep slate part of the build. However, in order to progress from here, we would have to go for yet another resource gathering mission. After having seen quite a lot of builds on Reddit, I realized that pretty much everyone was doing gradients, and since I'm very basic and don't have a mind of my own, I decided that I would do the same. The gradient I decided to go for started with dark prismarine and transitioned to stripped warped stem. The first blocks that I needed to go and gather were stripped warped stems and warped planks, so I flew back to my starter base once more to enter the real Nether. From there, I flew over to the warped forest nearby and started collecting the blocks. But after a tiny bit of gathering, I spotted a bastion, and I decided to go in and loot it, since I couldn't possibly think of any scenario where it would go wrong. But for some absolutely miraculous reason, I managed to get out alive, with 2 pieces of ancient debris, causing my level of dopamine to skyrocket. I then got on to the purest form of entertainment, that being breaking blocks that are impressively inconveniently placed. But once that was done, I made it back to the safety of our base, and gathered up the rest of the things we would need for our gradient, which was rather easy, as I basically just had to gather a bunch of cyan dye, and with that, I was ready to build the remainder of our walls. However, I was also planning on using shroom lights in our ceiling as well as the top portion of our walls, and in a rather unsurprising turn of events, I needed more of them, so I headed back to the real Nether yet again. And when the shroom light situation had been properly dealt with, I got on to some detailing by adding braziers of the soul variety as well as lanterns. I also decided to use anvils as a railing, which is something that I've never done before, as I've never been dumb enough to spend that much iron for absolutely no reason. However, my level of stupidity keeps reaching new heights, so here we are. I then returned to my base for what felt like the 100th time in this episode to collect the final things I would need to complete our project, which was grey glass as well as skulk. However, I had completely run out of ink sacs, as I had used them to make dark prismarine, so I resorted to committing a quick genocide. And since I had been a very smart and talented young man, I actually had quite a lot of glass from when we were trading with the villagers, which was very epic. My plan for the aforementioned grey glass was to place it as our flooring, which would sit on top of a layer of skulk, as I thought that would look cool. So I placed the glass in the manner discussed earlier. Once that was done, I flew over to the skulk farm that we had built in our last episode and gathered some skulk. And once that was placed in and spawn-proofed, our project was pretty much complete. But that is about all the time we have for this episode. So there we have it, the 10th episode of our incredibly stupid hardcore world. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next one.